The Persian Empire, often remembered for its golden palaces, its disciplined satrapies, and its divine kings, was far from a realm of harmony. Behind the gleaming facades of Persepolis and Susa lurked a darker truth, a truth written not in ink, but in the blood of those who dared to defy the great kings. Imagine the vastness of the Achaemenid dominion, from the banks of the Indus to the shores of the Aegean, from the frozen steppes of Scythia to the sands of Egypt. It was a realm so immense that its rulers called themselves kings of kings. Yet this title was not merely ceremonial. It was enforced through an unrelenting cycle of violence, fear, and ritualized submission. To rule the world, the Persians believed, one must remind every soul what happened to those who resisted divine order. In the throne halls of Persepolis, polished stone reflected not just sunlight but power. The great stairways were carved with images of subject peoples bearing gifts, kneeling, eyes lowered. But the artists never depicted what happened when one of those peoples stopped kneeling, when tribute ceased to flow, when satraps hesitated, when a province whispered rebellion. For those moments unleashed the empire's most merciless face. The royal messengers, the eyes and ears of the king, carried more than words. They brought warnings, sealed decrees of destruction, and death sentences masked in elegant script. When a province rebelled, armies did not march immediately. First came spies, infiltrators, and the deliberate poisoning of trust. The Persians understood that rebellion began not in weapons, but in hearts, and they sought to crush that spark before it became flame. Still, flames erupted, and when they did, they were met with horrors that defied imagination. Entire cities were erased from maps. Men were impaled by the hundreds as warnings, women and children enslaved, their names condemned to oblivion. The great kings believed such acts maintained divine balance. Their brutality was not chaos, but cosmic order restored through terror. The paradox of the Persian Empire was that it presented itself as the guardian of civilization, even as it perfected the machinery of cruelty. Royal inscriptions spoke of mercy, of bringing peace to the lands. Yet between those lines lay an empire built upon fear, a realm where peace was synonymous with silence, and silence was bought with blood. Now, before we descend deeper into this realm of fire and shadows, consider this. How does power sustain itself when its foundations are cruelty itself? Does the empire that thrives on fear ever truly sleep? Let me know in the comments what you think. Could an empire of terror ever endure without destroying itself? And if you're drawn to the darker truths of ancient history, leave a like, subscribe, and prepare to witness what the Persian emperors did when their provinces dared to rise. Rebellion within the Persian Empire was not a mere act of defiance. It was a sentence of death proclaimed upon entire peoples. For the great kings, insurrection was more than treason against the crown. It was heresy against the divine order that sustained their rule. To rise against the empire was to rise against Ahura Mazda himself, and such arrogance could only be answered with annihilation. Across the empire's sprawling territories, whispers of dissent often began in the margins, in the scorched deserts of Egypt, in the restless hills of Anatolia, or within the proud cities of Babylon. Each region had its own wounds, its own memories of independence crushed under Persian boots. The satraps, though powerful, ruled as extensions of the king's will, their loyalty purchased by privilege and enforced by fear. But even fear has limits. And when tribute demands grew unbearable or royal decrees insulted local gods, the fires of rebellion found breath once more. The Persians knew how to recognize those first embers. Scouts watched trade routes for irregularities. Informants listened in temples and taverns, tracing the murmurs of unrest. When the signs could no longer be ignored, the king's response came swift, precise, and merciless. Armies were summoned not simply to reclaim a province, but to make an example of it, to etch terror so deeply into the land that rebellion would wither in its memory. Villages that had once sung the praises of the empire found themselves surrounded by endless columns of soldiers, archers, cavalry, and the dreaded immortals, their ranks, shimmering with scale armor that caught the sunlight like a moving wall of fire. Behind them marched the royal engineers, bringing siege engines, battering rams, and the tools of obliteration. The message was clear. This was not conquest, but purification. When the assault began, the Persians attacked with both precision and spectacle. They believed that fear was most potent when witnessed. The gates of rebellious cities were torn down not merely for access, but for theater, so that survivors could see their sanctuaries defiled and understand the futility of defiance. Captured rebels were often paraded before their own people, their bodies mutilated in ways that erased dignity as much as life. Impalement, flaying, and crucifixion were not random cruelties. They were languages the empire spoke fluently, each act a syllable in its doctrine of domination. But perhaps the most chilling punishment was not physical. It was historical. The Persians were masters of memory. Royal inscriptions carefully omitted the names of those who resisted, ensuring that the rebels' very existence would dissolve into silence. To defy the empire was to be unmade, not only in flesh, but in story. The Persians understood that oblivion was the most enduring form of death. And yet, even as the smoke of burned cities rose to the heavens, the great kings viewed their actions as justice. In their minds, the empire was not cruel. It was righteous, cleansing itself of disease. The flames consuming those provinces were not born of rage but of duty, to preserve order in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. The rebels, too, believed themselves justified. They fought not merely for freedom, but for memory, for the right to exist outside the shadow of the royal throne. And so, the empire and its subjects became locked in a perpetual cycle, one side burning to preserve, the other burning to resist. From the ruins of Sardis to the ashes of Babylon, the lesson echoed across centuries. In the Persian world, disobedience had a price measured not in gold or grain, but in blood and silence. And those who dared to challenge the empire soon discovered that the wrath of the great kings was not a storm to be weathered. It was the fire that consumed empires themselves. When Babylon rebelled, it did not merely defy a king, it spat in the face of a god. For centuries, the city had been the beating heart of Mesopotamia, proud, opulent, and unbroken. But when it rose against Darius I, the newly crowned King of Kings, it signed its own death warrant. What followed was not a siege, but a ritual of vengeance so precise and merciless that even the echoes of it seemed to haunt the empire for generations. Darius had inherited a vast, fractured dominion. Rebellions flared across its borders like sparks, threatening to ignite the whole tapestry of conquest. But Babylon's defiance was the most intolerable. Twice the city rebelled, first under Nidintu-Bel and then under Araka, each time declaring a false king of Babylon. The insult was beyond politics. It was theological. Babylon claimed divine favor, daring to place its own gods above Ahura Mazda. To Darius, this was sacrilege. To disobedience, he would answer with extermination. When the Persian armies surrounded the great city, Babylon believed itself untouchable. Its double walls were legendary, towering fortifications wide enough for chariots to race atop them. The Euphrates flowed through its heart, feeding the city as it had for millennia. Yet even stone and water could not shield it from the methodical fury of Darius. He cut supply lines, strangled trade, and unleashed spies to fracture Babylon from within. Months turned into agony. Famine spread like rot. The once mighty capital began to devour itself. Then came betrayal. Herodotus speaks of a Persian trick, of soldiers finding entry through a dried riverbed, of a night assault that ended centuries of pride. Whether legend or truth, what followed was horror. The Persians entered Babylon not as conquerors but as executioners. Thousands were slain where they stood. Others were dragged from their homes to die publicly as warnings. The great temples were stripped of their treasures, and idols once worshipped as divine were paraded and shattered before the eyes of their priests. Darius ordered that the city's gates be torn down and its walls partially dismantled, a symbolic mutilation of its body. He knew that the soul of Babylon was pride, and to destroy that pride, he had to make the city remember what it had lost. The rebels' leaders were impaled along the main avenues, their corpses left for days beneath the scorching sun. The river that once sustained life now carried the stench of death. Yet even in the midst of devastation, Darius crafted his own narrative of righteousness. In his inscriptions, he wrote not of massacre, but of restoration. He claimed to have cleansed the land of lies, to have returned divine order to chaos. The rebels, he who said, were followers of the lie, a phrase that turned butchery into divine justice. To the empire it was not murder, it was purification, but the price of such purification was staggering. Babylon never truly recovered. The city that once rivaled heaven itself was reduced to a trembling shadow of its former glory. Darius may have conquered it, but in doing so, he crippled one of the empire's greatest jewels. The smoke of its burning rose like a prayer that no god answered. To the Persians, it was victory. To history, it was a wound that never healed. When Xerxes ascended the throne, he inherited not only his father's empire, but also his ghosts. The rebellions that had scarred Darius's reign still smoldered beneath the surface, unseen, yet alive. And Xerxes, more than any ruler before him, understood that to control such a vast realm was not merely a matter of armies or gold. It required theater, it required terror, sanctified by ritual. From the beginning, Xerxes presented himself not just as a king, but as an instrument of divine vengeance. His coronation was steeped in sacred ceremony, where priests invoked Ahura Mazda to grant him dominion over the earth. But within the incense and chants, there was also an unspoken vow that every act of rebellion would be extinguished not simply by war but by spectacle, ritualized punishment that transformed disobedience into a warning carved in flesh and stone. The revolts came swiftly. Egypt rose first, claiming independence under its native pharaohs. Then Babylon dared once more to resist. For Xerxes, these were not military challenges. They were affronts to cosmic order. And so he responded with a choreography of devastation designed to erase not only his enemies, but the very memory of their defiance. In Egypt, temples that had stood for 2 millennia were desecrated. Sacred hieroglyphs were chiseled from walls, names of rebel pharaohs obliterated. Priests who had blessed the rebellion were flayed alive, their skins hung at temple gates as offerings to the gods of punishment. The Nile itself became a river of lamentation, carrying fragments of burned villages downstream like ashes of forgotten prayers. Then came Babylon's turn. Xerxes, recalling his father's vengeance, vowed to complete what Darius had begun. The city was stormed, its temples destroyed once again. Most infamous of all, he ordered the demolition of the Esagila, the grand temple of Marduk, Babylon's supreme deity. To strike at the god was to annihilate the spirit of the people. The act was not one of strategy, but of purification. Xerxes did not merely conquer rebellion, he erased its soul. His methods were chillingly deliberate. Prisoners were executed publicly at dawn, their deaths timed with ceremonial precision. Captured leaders were displayed on platforms before the masses, their bodies pierced and broken as priests recited prayers of royal justice. Every blow, every scream, was part of a script meant to remind all who watched. That rebellion was not only futile, it was sacrilege. In the ruins that followed, Xerxes rebuilt what he had destroyed, but only in form. The new temples and palaces were Persian in design, their inscriptions glorifying his name and his god. The old gods of the provinces were buried, replaced by the imperial religion of the King of Kings. Resistance had not just been defeated, it had been rewritten. And yet, behind the perfection of his triumphs, there lingered a terrible truth. The empire's Peace once again was born of silence, a silence too absolute to endure. The subjects of Persia obeyed, but not from loyalty. They obeyed because fear had replaced faith. Xerxes believed he had purged his empire of rebellion, but in erasing the voices of his enemies he ensured that only whispers remained, whispers that would one day swell into the storms that doomed his bloodline. History remembers Xerxes for his monuments, his wars, his glory. But beneath the marble and gold lies the ritual of destruction that defined his rule, a legacy built not upon worship, but upon the sacred theater of fear. What do you think? Was Xerxes a god of order or a king of terror? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion shapes how history is remembered. The Persian Empire did not survive through benevolence. It endured through mastery, an intricate system designed to break wills and bind millions beneath a single crown. Darius and Xerxes did not merely conquer with armies. They engineered obedience with instruments more subtle and enduring than swords. The architecture of their dominion was not built on stone, it was built on fear. In the heart of Persepolis, the empire's pulse beat through corridors of power. There, royal scribes documented every act of devotion and disobedience, every shipment of tribute, every rumor of unrest. Surveillance was sacred. The eyes and ears of the king moved unseen across the empire, carrying whispers like venom. To live under Persian rule was to know that the king's gaze was everywhere. Even in silence one was seen. Fear began in language. Official proclamations described rebellion not as crime, but as the lie, a cosmic evil to be purged. The subjects of Persia were taught that resistance was not only treasonous but unholy. The result was psychological submission, a conditioning that fused politics with theology. Disobedience became not just dangerous, it became blasphemy. Yet words alone could not sustain terror. The Persians turned punishment into art. Impalement was their masterpiece. A rebel was raised upon a stake, his body sliding downward by gravity's cruel patience, the pole piercing from spine to throat until life itself surrendered to spectacle. The condemned were placed along highways and city gates, their bodies twisting in the desert wind, warning travelers of what awaited dissenters. The message was not subtle, it was eternal. Enslavement was the second pillar of control. The empire consumed human lives as tribute, laborers for its canals, miners for its silver, artisans for its palaces. For the Persians, slaves were both resource and reminder. Each one was a living token of submission, a fragment of rebellion reforged into usefulness. To chain a man was to erase his name and replace it with silence. Even the act of forced labor was imbued with ritual. It was the empire breathing through those it had conquered. But there was also manipulation. The Persians excelled at dividing their subjects, rewarding loyalty with privileges while crushing dissent with merciless efficiency. Local elites were granted positions of authority, their loyalty purchased with gold and fear. Betrayal became a tool of governance. The satraps ruled under constant suspicion, aware that a single whisper could bring the king's wrath. In this way, loyalty and paranoia became indistinguishable. The Persians also weaponized mercy. When they spared a defeated leader, it was not compassion, it was strategy. The pardoned were paraded through the empire as broken symbols of imperial grace, their survival more humiliating than death. To live after rebellion was to exist as a living monument to submission. Every mechanism of power served one purpose: to maintain the illusion that resistance was impossible. The empire did not need to kill everyone. It only needed to convince its subjects that their deaths would mean nothing. It was psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. And it worked. From the royal inscriptions of Darius to the silent ruins of Persepolis, the legacy of this system endures. The Persians built a civilization of wonder, but beneath its grandeur lay an invisible machinery that ground rebellion into dust and sculpted obedience from terror. No proclamation of peace could conceal the truth. The empire's greatest achievement was not its conquests, but its mastery of control. And that control, like the stakes that lined its roads, was sharpened on the suffering of countless souls who dared to imagine freedom. In the heart of the Persian mind, punishment was never merely retribution, it was theology in motion. Every act of vengeance carried the weight of divine purpose, a ritual reaffirmation of the cosmic order between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, the loyal and the defiant. To punish rebellion was not only to restore law, it was to restore the universe. The Achaemenid kings viewed themselves as vessels of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of light and justice. But light in their hands burned. The great kings believed that the flame of divine order demanded fuel, and often that fuel was human. Each execution, each destruction of a city, was a sacrifice offered to maintain the fragile balance between chaos and the sacred authority of the throne. Fire held a power unlike any other. In Persian culture, it was the purest of elements, a bridge between mortals and gods. Temples kept eternal flames, tended day and night by priests who saw in its glow the very breath of Ahura Mazda. Yet that same fire, when turned toward rebellion, became an instrument of annihilation. Towns that defied the king were set ablaze as acts of ritual cleansing. To burn a rebel's home was to erase the stain of sin. The empire's armies carried torches not just to light their way, but to carry the justice of heaven into the heart of disobedience. The symbolism was deliberate and cruelly elegant. When Xerxes ordered the burning of temples in Egypt and Babylon, he did not simply destroy idols, he reasserted divine supremacy. The flames consumed not just the wood and stone of sanctuaries, but the faith that had defied him. Through destruction, he proclaimed purification. In Persian ideology, punishment was not vengeance born of wrath. It was restoration born of necessity. The universe demanded balance, and rebellion was imbalance incarnate. Even the methods of execution reflected cosmic meaning. Impalement was the punishment of those who lied, those who, in defying the king, defied truth itself. Crucifixion was reserved for the most egregious offenders, symbolizing the body torn between heaven and earth. Beheadings were carried out in solemn ceremony, with priests chanting as blades fell, transforming slaughter into liturgy. The spectacle of death became a sermon on divine justice. Among the soldiers and officials who carried out these deeds, fear and faith intertwined. Many believed they were acting as extensions of the God's will, that every scream silenced another echo of the lie. The empire's bureaucrats recorded executions with the same precision used for harvests and taxes. The annihilation of a village was not chaos. It was accounting, balancing the scales of divine harmony. The fire burned both ways, however, for while it purified the empire's peripheries, it also consumed the humanity of those who wielded it. In time, even the kings themselves became prisoners of the flame they had invoked. The line between sacred vengeance and madness blurred until their own rule resembled the chaos they claimed to destroy. But perhaps that was the unspoken truth, that in their quest to uphold cosmic order, the Persian emperors became its greatest violators. For every city burned, every rebel impaled, every god silenced, they drew closer to the very darkness they sought to banish. The fire that illuminated their dominion also cast the longest shadows. In the end, the sacred fire of vengeance did not preserve the empire. It consumed it. The smoke that rose from conquered lands carried with it the prayers of the dying and the pride of kings who mistook destruction for divinity. And somewhere, beyond the flames, the gods they worshipped remained silent. For every empire that rises, there are those who refuse to kneel. Within the Persian dominion, rebellion was not uncommon, it was inevitable. Across mountains, deserts, and rivers, men whispered of freedom, of gods older than Persia's, of lands that once ruled themselves. Yet to challenge the King of Kings was to challenge fate itself. And fate under Persian rule was merciless. The stories of those who defied Persia are scattered fragments, half erased, half remembered. They come to us through the voices of enemies and conquerors alike, all marked by the same tone of dread. There was Ramnes of Elam, who believed his people could reclaim their ancient pride, Inaros of Egypt, who led his army beneath the burning sun, dreaming of liberation, and Gaumata, the false prophet who dared to steal Darius's throne by deception. Each of them, for a brief, blinding moment, touched the flame of glory, and each of them was consumed by it. Rebellion against Persia was not war. It was suicide performed on a national scale. When the great kings responded, they did so with a ritual precision that turned vengeance into performance. The captured leaders were paraded before their own soldiers, forced to watch as their families were executed one by one. Their names were cursed in royal inscriptions, their legacies rewritten as lies. The Persians called it justice. To the rest of the world, it was erasure. The empire's punishments followed patterns older than memory. In Egypt, the bodies of rebels were left for the vultures, their bones bleaching beneath the same sun that once witnessed their triumph. In Babylon, the execution platforms rose like altars, and the screams of the condemned blended with the chants of the priests. In the mountains of Anatolia, entire tribes were relocated, their villages burned, their languages forbidden. To rebel was to lose not only one's life, but one's history. Some of these punishments were so severe that they entered legend. The Persian general Megabyzus once captured a group of Greek mercenaries fighting for Egypt. Instead of a swift death, he had them crucified facing the rising sun, so that their last sight would be the dawn that would never again belong to them. To the Persians, such scenes were lessons written in blood, reminders that the empire's mercy had limits measured only by obedience. But there was a deeper cruelty still. The great kings understood that death alone was too merciful for defiance. True punishment was survival in shame. A defeated rebel might be spared, only to live as a satrap under constant scrutiny, his every decision shadowed by fear. His wealth, his title, his comfort, all poisoned gifts reminding him that he existed only by the king's tolerance. It was the slow death of pride, stretched across years. Yet in the ruins of those lost rebellions, one can still sense something unbroken. The Persians destroyed temples, burned cities, erased names, but they could not extinguish memory. The stories survived in whispers, carried by travelers, written in hidden tablets, passed from slave to slave. The empires of the earth are vast, but memory is the one rebellion that never dies. And so, the rebels became ghosts haunting the empire they failed to destroy. Their ashes mixed with the dust of Persia's triumphs, their curses carried on the wind that swept across its golden palaces. Each rebellion was a wound that never fully healed, a reminder that even the greatest empire was built atop the bones of those who refused to bow. History, after all, is written by the victors, but it is haunted by the defeated. What about you? If you had lived beneath the shadow of the Persian throne, would you have obeyed, or would you have burned with the rebels? Share your thoughts in the comments. History, as preserved by the Persians, was written not in ink, but in obedience. Every royal inscription, every monumental relief carved into stone, was both a record and a command, a carefully constructed narrative of divine order and imperial righteousness. The scribes of the empire were not mere chroniclers. They were priests of propaganda, shaping the memory of a world that bled beneath the seal of the King of Kings. In Persepolis, their chisels sang on, limestone. Darius and Xerxes were depicted as eternal, untouched by time or blood. Around them stood rows of loyal subjects bearing gifts, their eyes lowered in reverence. Nowhere in those carvings do we see the smoke of rebellion, the agony of conquest, the screams of those who resisted. To the empire, such things were not history, they were heresy. What was written in stone became sacred truth. What was not written ceased to exist. The official archives of the Achaemenid state were vast, efficient, and mercilessly selective. Royal scribes recorded taxes, tributes, punishments, and proclamations, but never regret. When rebellions were crushed, the details were distilled into a single phrase: "I restored order." The words repeated across tablets and inscriptions, echoing like a mantra that turned genocide into governance. The scribes, bound to their task, transformed horror into holiness. And yet, fragments of the truth slipped through the cracks. In the writings of Greek historians, in the laments of conquered priests, in the surviving records of Babylon, we glimpse the hidden counter-narrative, the pain the Persians tried to silence. Herodotus wrote of impalements and crucifixions, of cities razed and people enslaved. The Babylonian chronicles, cautious but unbroken, spoke of temples destroyed and gods humiliated. Beneath the empire's script of perfection, another story bled quietly through: the story of the vanquished. For those who lived under Persian rule, writing itself became an act of resistance. In the shadows of destroyed temples, priests etched forbidden hymns to forgotten gods. Enslaved scholars recorded the memories of their people on shards of clay, hiding them beneath the floors of their captors' buildings. Each word was a seed of defiance, a refusal to let pain vanish into the silence of official truth. But the empire understood the power of memory. The Persians were not content to destroy bodies. They sought to dominate the narrative of the past. Their kings declared themselves restorers of justice, guardians of divine truth. To question their version of history was to question reality itself. Even their enemies were forced to speak their language, to frame their hatred within Persian metaphors of order and chaos. In this way, the Persians achieved something more enduring than conquest. They colonized memory. Centuries later, when the empire fell, the stones of Persepolis still spoke its chosen truth. The inscriptions remained, unbroken, whispering of kings who ruled by the will of the gods. The voices of the conquered were dust, their words scattered, their stories fragmented. But every silence carries weight. And if one listens closely enough, beneath the perfection of Persian stone, one can still hear the echo of human suffering, the breath of those whose pain became the foundation of imperial glory. For every king who claimed eternal triumph, there were 1,000 nameless scribes, slaves, and mourners who recorded the cost. They are the forgotten chroniclers of the empire's shadow, their pens trembling as they wrote the truth no stone dared to bear. They are the true historians of terror, the scribes of suffering. Empires, like living things, consume what they create. The Persian Empire, vast and radiant in its prime, was no exception. Its strength was born from unity, but its longevity demanded sacrifice. And soon the blood that had once conquered the world began to flow inward. What had been forged in conquest slowly turned upon itself, feeding on fear, paranoia, and decay. The empire that devoured nations eventually learned to devour its own. In the beginning, the machinery of power was perfect. Darius had built a structure so intricate that rebellion seemed impossible. Satraps ruled provinces under the watchful gaze of royal inspectors. Soldiers marched with divine purpose, and the treasury overflowed with tribute from every corner of the known world. But perfection is fragile. It breeds suspicion. And within the heart of Persepolis, the same fear that had crushed rebels began to whisper against the throne itself. Loyalty, once sacred, became a weapon. The king trusted no one, not his satraps, not his generals, not even his blood. Brothers turned against brothers, fathers executed sons, queens poisoned rivals in the name of purity. The empire's system of control, once designed to suppress rebellion, became a mechanism of internal terror. Every act of cruelty created new enemies. Every execution spawned another ghost. The satraps, once pillars of imperial order, became predators in their own right. Their private armies grew, their greed swelled, and their loyalty withered. The same spies who had once uncovered rebellion now traded secrets for gold. Persia had conquered half the world, but it could not conquer itself. The empire's greatest threat no longer came from the Greeks or the Scythians. It came from within its golden heart. The royal court, once the stage of divine ceremony, transformed into a theater of paranoia. Accusations of treachery filled the air like incense. Darius III's predecessors had ruled through awe. He ruled through desperation. He executed nobles by the dozens, their corpses left as reminders that even the purest lineage could rot. Eunuchs, once silent servants, became kingmakers, manipulating decrees in the shadows. The empire that had once feared rebellion now feared itself. Even the gods seemed to turn away. The sacred fire still burned in the temples, but its light had grown cold. The priests chanted of truth and order, but the empire's truth had become a lie, its order a mask for madness. The same rituals of purification that had cleansed the lands of rebels now cleansed the palace of the living. Fear was no longer the empire's weapon, it was its disease. And as internal corruption spread, the borders weakened. Egypt slipped away. Babylon stirred once more. The Greeks, who had once trembled before Xerxes, now advanced under Alexander, carving through Persia like a blade through silk. When the young Macedonian king entered Persepolis, he found not an empire of gods, but a decaying carcass, magnificent in death, hollow in spirit. In its twilight, the Persian Empire stood as a monument to its own contradictions, a civilization of art, order, and enlightenment, built upon foundations of suffering. It had sought to master the world through fear, and in the end, it feared everything, even itself. The great machine that had crushed countless nations turned inward, grinding its creators into dust. The empire that devoured its own children did not fall in a single moment. It rotted slowly, beautifully, tragically, like a god that had forgotten why it was divine. And when its flames finally died, the world it once ruled did not mourn, for the ghosts of its victims had long been waiting in silence, whispering their judgment into eternity. Centuries have passed since the fire of the Persian Empire dimmed, yet its shadow still stretches across the memory of civilization. The names of its kings, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, linger like echoes carved into the stone of time, their monuments standing as both triumphs of human ambition and tombs of human suffering. For though their palaces have crumbled and their empires turned to dust, the methods they perfected, the machinery of power, fear, and control, remain alive in every age that followed. The Persians did not merely rule through conquest, they ruled through the illusion of divine destiny. Their ideology, born from the light of Ahura Mazda, justified every act of domination. To bring order was to wage holy war against chaos. To punish rebellion was to cleanse the world of lies. This theology of power would outlive the empire itself, passed down through empires that came after, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, even the modern states that still cloak authority in the language of righteousness. Their legacy lies not only in the ruins of Persepolis or the fragments of royal inscriptions, but in the human mind, in the way fear and faith can intertwine until obedience feels sacred. The Persians understood something timeless, that the most enduring empire is not built from walls or armies, but from belief. When the conquered begin to see submission as virtue, the conqueror's work is complete. Yet, every empire leaves ghosts. Beneath the dust of Persia's grandeur lie the bones of those who dared to speak against it, the slaves who built its monuments, the priests whose gods were silenced, the rebels whose names were erased. Their pain seeps through history like smoke from an ancient fire that never truly died. The Persians believed they could write their own eternity, but eternity has a way of remembering everything we try to forget. Even today we walk among the ruins of their lessons. The same systems of control, the same rituals of fear, still echo in the corridors of power. The empire may be gone, but the idea of empire endures. An idea that began when kings learned that fear could be worshipped and cruelty could wear the mask of order. The ghosts of the East still whisper to us, warning that no empire built on silence can last forever. So as we look back upon the burning cities, the broken idols, and the crowns drenched in blood, one question remains. Have we truly escaped the shadow of those ancient kings? Or do we still live within it, repeating their mistakes beneath different names? If this story made you think, leave a comment below. Tell us what you believe the true legacy of the Persian kings really is. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the dark side of ancient history. And leave a like if you want to see how the next empire rose and fell in the same endless cycle of blood, faith, and power.